So I went on eBay and I bought something. The PowerMac G5 was released sometime around June of 2003, and at the time, it was touted as being the fastest personal computer in the world. Now, however much of a stretch that may have been, the G5 was still a really unique computer. At a time when Windows XP was the standard for most homes and the majority of professional work was being done with these very expensive, specially equipped machines from companies like Silicon Graphics, Apple wanted to sort of bridge the gap between power user and industry professional, and their solution was the G5. So let's go ahead and talk about what makes the PowerMac G5 such an interesting system even in 2021. So right here is my early 2005 model PowerMac G5, and those of you with a keen eye for detail may have noticed that it's absolutely beat to hell, but I'll see what I can do about that later in the video. Either way, taking off the big aluminum side panel, we can see the insides of the Mac itself, and honestly it's surprising just how well everything is laid out inside. Right here, you can see our dual air-cooled PowerPC 970FX CPUs running at a whopping, for the time, 2 GHz, 2 GB of DDR RAM, an NVIDIA FX 5200 AGP graphics card, and most importantly, the fans. Just in case you somehow missed it, the G5 was designed to move a lot of air through the case, but all this ventilation actually allows for a very quiet system even by today's standards. Unfortunately for me though, I do want to do things that Steve Jobs only blessed certified technicians to do, like taking out the CPUs, which isn't exactly a trivial task. But after taking out all of the pretty dusty components, I could get to work removing the 8 Allen head screws that keep each CPU card in place, which are, for whatever reason, super deep in the case. I had to put this extension thing on my screwdriver just to get down far enough to actually reach the screws. Once I finally did get those out though, we could actually take our first good look at the PowerPC 970FX CPU cards and all of the other dirty components inside the case. I went ahead and gave everything a quick cleaning just for good measure, and then I started working on repasting each CPU. The 970FX chips in this G5 are actually a die shrink of the original 970 CPUs that came in older model G5 computers. These new processors don't consume nearly as much power as the original chips did, and this basically meant that you got a quieter and more efficient computer. But eventually these cooler FX chips would later get replaced with the PowerPC 970MP chip, which was basically 2 FX cores on one chip. I know this all might sound a little complicated, and probably because it is, but basically this meant that there were 3 major revisions of the G5 between 2003 and 2005. The original power-hungry 970 models, the more efficient 970FX models like the one I have here, and the final 970MP models. And each of those had their own single or multi-processor setups depending on which configuration you bought. I could probably spend all day talking about the little differences between each of these computers, but for now I think it's a better idea to just get this thing put back together so we can check it out. Of course, to do that I'll also need an operating system, and since Apple didn't continue supporting PowerPC Macs past OS X Leopard, that's what I'll be running on this G5. Before I continue though, I just want to quickly mention some of the ports on the back, like the DVI and ADC connectors on the graphics card, ports for connecting Wi-Fi and Bluetooth antennas, and everything else you'd expect from a Mac from this era, like USB 2, FireWire 400 and 800 gigabit Ethernet, and a spot for a phone jack so you could use the built-in 56K dial-up modem. Unfortunately, mine didn't have one included, so it's blanked out in the I/O panel on the back, but when I saw this, I realized just how ahead of its time the G5 was. This computer literally had the ability to connect to both gigabit networks and wireless networks at a time when a lot of people were still connecting to the internet on dial-up, and that's pretty impressive in my opinion. At this point, I also wanted to see if I could improve the looks of this computer just a bit, so I tried using some of this thick silver leaf colored paint, which actually looked really good on the front of the computer and did help with some of the deep gouges and scratches on the front. With all of that out of the way though, I could actually turn on the computer, and I did run into some minor issues like the computer literally not booting at all, and there may have been some board level repair involved, but I'll dive into that later as it's not all that important right now. Just imagine that everything went perfectly and we're booted into Leopard. The PowerMac G5 is actually a really neat computer to use, and I do have to admit that Leopard aged better than its main competitor. But anyway, let's get into the PowerPC experience itself and see what it's actually like to use this thing for anything more than a solid aluminum doorstop. If you went and bought all the stuff that I have here, like the G5 desktop, 20-inch cinema display, keyboard, mouse, etc. back in 2005, it would have set you back just about $3,000 US. But what's pretty amazing about Apple's design strategy, even going this far back, is how well their products age. Want to see some PCs from around the same era? Well, here you go. Yikes. Apple was always able to offer a premium experience for the pro customer, and that philosophy meant that I get a fancier looking computer to keep under my desk when I'm done with this video. Thanks, Apple. Aside from that though, Leopard feels pretty smooth, even on a mechanical hard drive, and things actually work mostly how you'd expect them to in newer versions of macOS. The default Galaxy wallpaper might look a little dated today, and you definitely don't see this sort of skeuomorphic UI design anymore, complete with all the reflections and metal textures, but I'll take this over Windows 8 and Metro UI any day. Under the hood though, we still have a fully fledged version of OS X, meaning that we get halfway decent support for running things like Minecraft. I went ahead and grabbed a version of Minecraft 1.5.2 that's optimized for the G5 to see how it would run a slightly newer title that you might actually be able to play with some other people, and it was interesting. Running at 1080p at a mix of very low and low settings, I was able to get an average FPS somewhere in the low 10s, which got old pretty quick, so eventually I went ahead and brought my resolution down to 1280 by 800, and that got us up into the mid 30s, which was much more playable. Obviously, our bottleneck here is the GeForce FX 5200 graphics card, which was never supposed to be a very fast GPU, even back when this computer came out in 2005, so I didn't expect a whole lot. I would like to try upgrading this card to something like a GeForce 7800, which is one of the best cards that you can put in a G5 like this, but I have other computers that can also play Minecraft, so let's try something else. Using the 10.4 Fox web browser, we can actually get on some newer websites from this old PowerMac, so obviously I did what any reasonable person on YouTube would do and tried to play my own video on it, which went about as well as you might have expected. Even with a relatively new web browser, the internet is a way different place than it was back in 2005. After some trial and error, I got a few seconds of my video to load at 720p, but it refused to play back smoothly, and I eventually just gave up because the fans were starting to ramp up a lot, and I didn't want to burn out my G5. I bet if I tried to use a more optimized YouTube client, I might have gotten a little bit further, but modern HTML YouTube on the G5 just didn't work out very well for me. I figured that something more text-based like Discord might fare better on this computer, but unfortunately, I ran into pretty much the exact same issues. I was able to get myself signed in and read some messages in one channel, in one server, but the site was still very slow and it took me several minutes just to send a couple of words. I think it's pretty safe to say that the G5 was never intended to be used this way, and obviously apps that are optimized for PowerPC Macs would run way better on the system, but the problem is there's just not a whole lot of PowerPC apps that would still be as useful today as they were back in 2005. Unfortunately, the PowerMac G5 just wasn't enough to show Apple that IBM's PowerPC chips could hold their own against their Intel counterparts. Even worse, no one could get the G5 running cool enough to actually use it in any new PowerBook or iBook laptops, and all of this eventually led to Apple dropping the PowerPC architecture, and you probably know the story from here, moving over to Intel processors instead, with systems like the Mac Pro and MacBook Pro. So here we are, left with a lot of PowerPC Macs that don't really have any use outside of collecting just to say, I have a PowerMac G5. But this brings us to the part of the video that I really didn't want to make. Should you buy a PowerMac G5 here in 2021 or 2022, whenever you might be watching? Well, before I get into that, I need to talk about the problems that I had with the G5. I bought this one in quote, tested working condition, and when I hooked it up for the first time, it did actually power on, but it refused to boot into any sort of macOS installer that I tried to put in. The computer would just hang at this screen with the gray Apple logo, and the fans would slowly ramp up until they hit full blast. I tried booting in verbose mode, and I ended up getting stuck on this Dart enabled line pretty early in the boot log, which really didn't do me any good because I couldn't find anyone offering solutions on how to fix the problem throughout various different forum posts and guides, just articles about people's Macs dying out of nowhere, never to boot again. I did some asking around, and one person that I met on Discord was very kind, and they suggested that the problem may lie in the chipset on the back of the G5's logic board, so I did some research. The G5 actually has something called the U3 chip on the back side of the motherboard, which is actually responsible for handling all of the communications between the CPUs, RAM, expansion cards, and pretty much everything else inside the computer. Well, this chip gets pretty hot, and there's actually a complete heatsink assembly on the back of the board and a squirrel cage fan that work to keep this chip from overheating and failing. But over time, as the chip goes through a lot of thermal cycles and the thermal paste starts to dry out, this chip can get very, very hot. Getting stuck at the Dart enabled line at boot suggests that there's likely something wrong with this chip, and that will keep hanging the computer at boot until it's either reflowed or replaced. So I had to remove the entire logic board from the case and reflow the chip. I actually ended up doing this twice, once with a regular heat gun to see if it would have any impact, and that did actually work, but once I rebooted the computer, I ended up having the same issues. So I had to take everything apart again, and I waited until I could get some liquid rosin flux, and I tried to slowly heat the chip up with a temperature controlled hot air station and reflow the chip properly. I also went ahead and slightly drilled out the holes in the motherboard that hold down the U3 heatsink so I could replace the little plastic clips with some proper screws and nuts to make sure I had as much mounting pressure as possible, and somehow all of this actually worked. Now, I have absolutely no idea how long this G5 is going to keep working, and if I had to guess, I'm probably lucky that it's been working for as long as it has. It might keep running for another month or even a year if I'm really lucky, but unfortunately, this will be a problem that plagues every single PowerMac G5 you'll ever run into out in the wild. So if you have one that works right now, I would recommend at least repasting the U3 chip on the back of the board to make sure it keeps working for as long as possible. I didn't end up getting any footage of this because honestly, I didn't even know if I'd be making this video without a working G5, so I hope the pictures are good enough to give you an idea of what this whole experience ended up being like. What all this has taught me is that the PowerMac G5 was a really interesting computer, and I think we should all take a second to look back and respect the things that Apple managed to do with their last great PowerPC Mac. Let's just hope N1 does it a little better. So, with all that said, I think it's just about time to wrap up this video. I want to give you a big thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Let me know down in the comments what you think about Apple's PowerPC Macs, and I'll see you in the next video.